All right, man, peace. You know, brothers, I remember as a small child, my father would have many sports almanacs on his bookshelf. And of course, he had the baseball, sports almanac, basketball, football. And he would also have a lot of history books, a lot of biographies, etc. And I remember going through the baseball almanac and stumbling across the list of the most prominent hitters in the history of baseball who led the league in career RBIs, career home runs, batting average, who won Triple Crowns, etc. And this person's name would always come up, that being Mr. Frank Robinson, who passed away. I believe it was on February 7th. And many people don't know how prominent a role he played in the early portion of the so-called black man being implemented into Major League Baseball. We hear a lot about Jackie Robinson, but throughout the 1950s, baseball was littered with black talent that will go on to transcend the sport and become Hall of Famers, all-time greats, etc. Willie Mays, Roberto Clemente, Frank Robinson, Hank Aaron, so on and so forth. So, of course, they're going to talk about it, and I'm going to chime in.
Hall of Famer and pioneer Frank Robinson has passed away at the age of 83. Robinson became MLB's first African-American manager in 1975. He's the only player to win MVP in both leagues. He was a first ballot Hall of Famer in 1982. Robinson won the Triple Crown with the Orioles in 1966.
And let me say this once again. Frank Robinson's name will still be relatively high on the list of all-time home run hitters and the all-time leaders in RBIs. And this is counting the steroid era that Major League Baseball went through from the mid-90s all the way through the mid-2000s. So that shows you how great a player he was. And as will be revealed later on in this episode of the Stephen A. Smith Show, Frank Robinson was a high school basketball teammate of Bill Russell's.
And ranks 10th on the career home run list with 586. Stephen A., incredible resume right there. What is the legacy of Frank Robinson in your opinion?
The legacy of Frank Robinson is just what you listed off. Not only was he one of the great baseball players of all time, he was a trailblazer. He was also the first so-called black manager in the history of Major League Baseball, which is interesting because, as I stated, he was also a teammate of Bill Russell's in high school on the basketball team. And Bill Russell happened to be the first black basketball head coach in the NBA. So that's very interesting as well.
He's a pioneer. That's his legacy. First African-American manager in Major League Baseball. Player manager. 1975, he walks to home plate and gives out the card, the lineup card, and then ultimately he steps up to play because he was a player manager and smacks a home run that particular game against the New York Yankees, no less. 586 career home runs. We all know this 14-time All-Star, but you know, for me, I often take into account, Max, what you go through to get to where you are. And
Agreed.
And when you consider, you know, Jim Crow laws, segregation, the prejudices that he had to exist, not even being able to eat from the same restaurants or stay in the same hotels as his white teammates to accomplish what he accomplished throughout his illustrious career, you can't say enough. And obviously, just like Jackie Robinson was a pioneer in 1947 for integrating baseball, he opened doors for minority hires as managers because he was the first to show that indeed you can do something like that as well.
You know, a lot today you're going to hear about Frank Robinson insofar as he's mentioned as a pioneer, the first African-American manager, and all this kind of stuff, what Stephen A. just said, and all that needs to be said. It's almost a shame that overshadows in many respects his legacy as a player. As you mentioned, Molly, won the Triple Crown, that's exceedingly rare, was a 2-time MVP and multiple-time World Series champion.
Absolutely. Frank Robinson was a dominant player. When I first heard that he passed away, I texted my father about it, and then he called me up about 2 hours later, and he was relatively incredulous because, you know, when your sports heroes start to pass away, at least the sports heroes that you had when you were a child, it starts to remind you of your own mortality. And many of us will experience the same thing. That's why it's always important to keep the Most High first. But we tend to partition our life based on our experiences. And a part of our childhood experiences is the music that we listened to growing up, also the sports figures that we watched growing up, the movie stars, the television stars, etc. So that's a natural part of life. But Frank Robinson is an all-time great who often gets neglected because of bigger names like Willie Mays or Hank Aaron, because Willie Mays had the flair and the flash. Hank Aaron has all the records. But Frank Robinson, he was up there with any of them. A dominant baseball player.
Two-time MVP, first guy ever to do it in both leagues. He won one in the AL with the Orioles, one in the NL with the Reds. He was, because a contemporary of Willie Mays and Hank Aaron, and Willie Mays is considered by many the greatest player who ever lived, and Hank Aaron...
My father still believes that Willie Mays is the greatest baseball player of all time.
Aaron wound up the all-time home run champ. He is often overlooked in these kind of conversations, but Frank Robinson was one of the handful of greatest hitters who's ever played a game that, by the way, there have been 120 World Series played. There are thousands of players every year in the Major League. There are like 100,000 Major Leaguers to choose from throughout history, and he's one of the maybe 10 best hitters who ever lived.
Well, he's up there. He almost got to 2,000 RBIs. I think he's somewhere around in the mid-1800s. He almost got to 3,000 hits. I think that it speaks a lot of a man's character when he retires just before he reaches those type of milestones, because it tells you a lot about him. That's why I always say that it's added a lot to the overall aura of Barry Sanders and Jim Brown that they retired while they were still relatively in their prime. It adds mystique to their legacy, because people look back and they say to themselves when they think about Barry Sanders, wow, he could have rushed for 8,000 more yards. Well, most likely he would not have rushed for 8,000 more yards, but the fact that he retired in his prime makes people say things like that. When you look at a Frank Robinson who retired just short of 600 home runs, just short of 2,000 RBIs, just short of 3,000 hits, that tells you that in his mind he was done, and he was not going to try to just keep holding on to reach those milestones.
The reason his legacy is important in terms of blazing a trail, that's all based upon the incredible player he was.
I tell you this, I want to know who were the 10.8% of the people that voted against him being a first ballot Hall of Famer.
Well, I say that all the time. It's amazing that Mariano Rivera is the first person to ever be voted into the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame with 100% of the vote. And we're talking about a league, Major League Baseball, who's had not just great black players, but also great white players who you would think would have gotten voted in unanimously into the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame. Players like Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams, Mickey Mantle, etc. Not even mentioning Willie Mays and Hank Aaron, so on and so forth. So it shows you how petty many of these media members can be.
Because that makes absolutely no sense.
100%. And our heart goes out to the family of Frank Robinson.
Yeah.
Before you go to Max, just a little.
Let's start.
This was a tidbit for you. Back to Frank Robinson for a second. Do you know who his teammates were at McClemens? What is it? McClemens High School in Oakland. You know who his teammates were? Curt Flood and Bill Russell.
Wow.
What is in the water?
Legend.
In the drinking fountain at that high school.
Curt Flood.
Vada Pinson also. I'm not quite sure if he was a teammate of Frank Robinson's, but he also attended the same high school around the same time. Vada Pinson was about 4 years behind Bill Russell, so he probably was not there when Bill was there. But I believe that Vada Pinson was also there when Frank Robinson was there. For those of you who don't know, Vada Pinson was also an all-time great player. I believe that he played with the Oakland A's throughout the 1960s into the early 70s.
Father free agency, Bill Russell, the ultimate champion, 11-time champion. They were all teammates in basketball.
Segregated water fountains, by the way. You know who missed out?
In Oakland, California.
Whatever white people weren't drinking from that water fountain, that's who missed out with segregation.
There you go.
Whoa, what's going on there?
Here goes Marxist Max going overboard again. I wish I could have been there to drink from those water fountains that those colored guys were drinking from. Would have made my day. But anyway, once again, congratulations to Frank Robinson for living a wonderful life. Peace. So peace.